We are live. For those of you joining us on video, we are looking at 1st and 2nd Samuel, maybe, or we're just looking at Samuel. Um, again, as I said, let me give you just since we've skipped a week, I'll give you a little mini catch up. The larger picture that we're looking at through all of this is because last time, right before Christmas, we had Ruth, and Ruth was a great book and it left us all feeling warm and cozy. You've probably long forgotten the debauchery and horribleness of the judges. And no, Jim is saying no. They still haunt him. And actually, even Samuel has a few dark moments, but not like Judges. But we have this long history, and if you want to look at it from a 50,000-foot perspective, again, God makes a covenant with Adam. Adam and fails and the fall happens, and then the world is chaos, and God makes a covenant with Noah, the Noahic covenant, same thing as Adam, be fruitful and multiply, and then starts that process. And again, but this time promises he won't destroy anything. So then Abraham comes on the scene, and then God makes a covenant with this guy Abraham. And this covenant is for a land, descendants, and a name. And we see that process developing through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, leading to their occupation in Egypt and to their growing as a people, but also to the fear from the Pharaoh there that put them into slavery for 400 and some years. Moses comes on the scene, liberates them in the great Exodus story, crossing the Red Sea, finds himself in the wilderness. Now there's this Mosaic covenant around the idea of obeying this law of the Decalogue, of the 10 Commandments. And you'll see some of that surface in Samuel as well. You'll see a lot of connection points. Because again, what happened is all these covenants that we've looked at, Adam and then Noah and then Abraham and then Moses, and now of the Old Testament covenants, we're about to get into the Davidic covenant, which is the last of the 5 covenants that God made with the Israelites. So if you have a handle of those, again, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, those are the sort of key turning points of the Old Testament. If you can grab hold of those and say, this is how God has constantly moved and dealt with Israel. And so what we have then is this time of 40 years in the wilderness. They've had the commandments. They're doing okay, but in terms of just surviving, and their children don't have a memory of this slavery, and that's again why the Israelites and Jews today continue to tell the story, because it's so important for the identity for who they are as Jews. And that led right up to the Jordan, right to the crossing. Moses didn't get to go because he struck the rock and he had a bad temper, and God sent him across with Joshua. And then they went into that tribal period where Joshua divided them up into 12 tribes. And then you have this period where we looked at the Judges, and you get this sort of glimpse of what the actual occupation of Canaan looked like, because Canaan was Canaan before, and then it became Israel. And you have this sense of the tribes were compromising left and right. And in order to try to bring justice, God brought about judges. And they were there not so much to rule, although there were some cases of that. Deborah show reminds us that there was those cases where she was actually trying to disperse justice. But in general, they were just there to kind of guide the people. So in lieu of a king, they had judges to judge their obedience to the law. And for those of you who weren't with us, Judges is a horrible book. Up and down, good judges, bad judges, good kings and neighboring, bad occupation. You have this just topsy-turvy. And again, Judges was a compilation of all of this. And then you have the last sort of main one that we all know about is Samson. And Samson was that final judge to the Philistines. And I'm only bringing that up because that'll play a role in Samuel, because the Philistines, from really Samson on, play a pretty significant role. And again, I don't know if you remember, if you have in your mind sort of Israel, with if this is, if I'm doing it from my angle, I don't know. Do you see? Is my hand on the right side of your screen or the left side of your screen? Left. Okay. So I got to do a reverse then. So I'll do it over here. So if this is the Mediterranean over here, you know what I'm talking about, and this is like Israel, and then the Red Sea is down, or the Red Sea is down here. Well, the Philistine area was this border, like everything that bordered, like you have Jerusalem up here, this area over here that bordered the Mediterranean Sea, was where the Philistines camped out. So all up and down that path, they kind of control the port town, and they were after sort of the ups and downs, the Philistines grew as a people, and they become a major player for thwarting not only the beginning of the development of what we understand as a monarchy in Israel, but really all the way through David. So from Samson all the way to David, the Philistines are sort of the main enemies. And so we just sort of hold that in your mind, that they're the people they're coastal people. And they were sort of and Goliath was a Philistine, and so that battle with the Philistines was growing, and it wasn't the Canaanites anymore after Judges. So then we had Ruth, but again, Ruth was something that came later, and they inserted it there just in terms of the timeline, and that fits to some extent. But really, what we're doing is we're kind of picking up to some extent after Judges, and we're carrying on this story with Samuel. So that's kind of the background. Any questions about that? I know if you're sick of me doing the summaries, but you're like, Jason, I already know all this stuff, that's great. I had a professor say to me once, if you're tired of hearing me say this, that means you've actually internalized the material and then you're doing good. So if you're feeling like I'm tired of hearing the reviews, but that flow is important, because each of those covenants were about God remaining faithful and Israel rebelling, and God sort of bringing them along to a place where they actually could respond in obedience. And so really, you could probably put an O and a D all over the Old Testament of where they were actually obeying and receiving the blessings that God has promised them, and disobeying and really experiencing the curse. And God, as I was reading earlier today on Samuel, I realized God's kind of about reality or natural consequences. Like, I'm going to let it go and see what happens, and you can just deal with the situation of what's happening. But God does intervene. But this is kind of the last. If we can make it through Samuel, we're looking at really sort of the beginning or the end, the beginning of the end, because things are with David. There's a major shift in how God relates to Israel. So let's if there's no questions, we'll dive into, I'll give you an overview of both books generally, and then I'll give you an overview of 1 Samuel, and then I'll give you a little bit more specific one of 2 Samuel when we get to it. But remember, originally in the Hebrew tradition, these were both one book. And they fit as one scroll, in part because prior to, I don't even know what century, the Masoretic text, they are the ones who put vowels in. The original Hebrew had 0 vowels. So all the little markings all around Hebrew, if you ever looked at it, none of those were there. They were just letters, and it was understood. And Hebrew, in terms of, I had to test with proficiency in Hebrew, and I wasn't proficient at all. I just barely got through it. It's a very fluid book, a lot of loosey-goosey interpretation. But it's okay, because it was, sort of a primitive language in the sense of it was. But when they translated it to Greek, that wasn't sufficient. So as it grew, and they were translated into Greek, it required a lot more language, and that's what you end up getting, those two scrolls. And they estimate that probably it was around the 2nd century BCE that it actually was written and compiled into those 2 books that we have, 1 and 2 Samuel. But it's important, when you look at the structure of the whole thing, that you understand it as one book, because there's a lot of parallelism from the beginning of the book. We will see in Hannah's song matches David's song at the end, and I'll point that out towards the end where you see those parallels. But in general, just understand that it's one whole book, and it still is in Jewish canon. They haven't separated that. The judge. So now we'll get into the general overview. Would be Samuel is about the introduction of a new prophet, and the movement from that prophetic voice that corrected the judges sort of scenario, and led to what we now know as a monarchy within Israel, or that established David as king. Judges kind of showed that Israel needed something more then Judges, that it wasn't working, that before that you had very strong leaders, Abraham, the father of the faith, Isaac, Jacob. You just have these main figures. Even Joseph ends up in Egypt and has this really powerful position. So you have all these very strong individual leaders. They were lineage, there was some lineage there going on, and I'm sure all Jews are related to some extent. But after Joseph, you see a breakdown of that genetic or that heredity sort of driving the passing down of leadership, because then you go from Moses, who had specific calling, and then you have Joshua that had a specific calling, and then you had all these random judges that were called with specific callings to this. It was sort of divinely appointed leadership. And what we're going to find is, after Samuel, who also was in that divinely appointed leadership, that it goes to Saul, and then from Saul, we'll talk about Saul later in a few minutes. But he after he messes up and is removed, David is established as this heredity-based monarchy. So they move from a tribal theocracy, where they had the 12 tribes, and there was cultures that developed, and even in those 12 tribes, and different tribes integrated within Canaanites, and dealt with those occupation of the land of Canaan differently. And what you have in what we're moving to in this book is this tribalism that was really what would be considered a theocracy, a divinely led sort of organization that God sort of gave and helped them sort of function in that way, to a united kingdom. And that united kingdom was under this understanding of a king in this rest of the way of the world. And it was the rest of the way that, the world operated at that time. There were a lot of kings, but that kingship then was important, because that went from David to Solomon to and it just carries on. And what happens is then that line leads to Jesus. And so you have this break: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Then you have this section in the middle where it's divinely appointed leadership. And then on the other side of that, it returns back to that sort of biological, genetic disposition, sort of what we have in England today, that if you're a leader because you're a part of, because you're connected to someone by blood. Okay, and so where are my notes? The authorship is unknown. And in fact, an interesting thing about that is it is not, Judges was a compiled book. Some of the other books have pieces. They thought they put them together. And this is actually a book that they actually think was written as a whole. It was cultivated, it was edited, it was carefully thought through, because in Samuel, you have some of the most complete pictures, or some of the fullest characters developed around David and Samuel, and you have these characters and Saul that actually you see facets of their personality that describe and inform understanding of their actions in a way that you really don't have outside of maybe just Moses. We don't know a lot about Joshua. It doesn't say a whole lot about his character, about who he was. You just know he was obedient and he was living it out. But you have these fully developed characters that are sort of cultivated in this narrative, and it was written with what would have been considered a more sophisticated Hebrew at the time. Although even though the vowels weren't in there was a sense of development of plot and a holistic understanding. And when you see that in the Hebrew parallels, again, from things like Hannah's prayer at the beginning and David's prayer at the end, and the way they contain some of the same information, this wasn't by chance. It wasn't just, it was cultivated that way so that it actually tells future generations about who these folks are. The main space or occupation or land or where it took place was in Canaan. So where the 12 tribes were, the occupation of the promised land, which we now know is Israel. But they didn't have all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Again, that was Philistine territory. So that's where some of that rub sort of comes. In terms of dating of the actual events themselves, it's thought to be about around 1000 BCE or before Christ, and it was probably compiled and began to sort of being written somewhere between 1000 and sort of 900, which is around the time of David, which is thought to be around the time of David. So there's just a sense of it was still, it's still about 3,000 years away from us, but they were compiling the story and building the story because it moves from that tribal understanding to the monarchy, and that was important for Israel's understanding for who they are in themselves. If you understand yourselves in small little tribes, and then all of a sudden you're a united nation, now that Israelite identity that happened probably with Abraham and Isaac until those tribes were divided was there beforehand. So you see a little bit of that parallelism between the unified version and then the tribalism, and now you have the sort of unified monarchy again. Okay, so that's kind of the general overview. The themes that you want to pay attention to, there's a lot of warnings in this about leadership. Samuel is a strong book about leadership, and you'll see these various figures that sort of rise. There's an immense sense of God's trust in David as a human, and David's in turn trust with God. And what makes David unique, really almost since probably maybe even Moses, is that David possessed a very unique humility. And that's juxtaposed with Saul's sense of arrogance for who he was. And so that's an important facet of Samuel, because the text really highlights that sense of David's humility, because it's from that, and this shouldn't surprise us now in retrospect, God constantly is using these figures in a humble way, from humble beginnings, to establish them as leaders in a very pointed way. If you're going to go back and read these before next week, or before we gather again, or I guess in 2 weeks till we gather again, one of the things that's interesting to note about that goes through both books is there's a lot of relationships between parent and child that are described. Even more so than in other books, but it's a notable feature of the Samuels, that there's just a sense of the way a parent relate. So you have Hannah, and you have Hannah and Samuel. You have Eli and his sons. You have what were the other ones? David and his sons later in 2 Samuel. And you just have this sense of there's a lot of relationships going on and how they're interacting, but parents and children, and in many ways, some of the dissension that exists there between them. All right. I think that's probably good for the general overview. I'm going to stop there and say, is there any questions before we dive into like sort of a section by section? I'll get a drink here. And I will say, just from this point forward, until we hit Psalms and Proverbs, we're kind of getting into not uncharted territories. I think anyone who's ever gone to Bible college or seminary is probably, or grown up in the church, is always pretty familiar with the Pentateuch and the story of the Israelites. But then once you get after David, it gets a little foggy. So, and the history of the books, actually, as you'll see in weeks to come, you'll start to see, as we start looking at these books in the order they are in the canon that we use, they're there for reasons, but we're going to start getting into some literature and prophetic books, and they still function in the same way in terms of how they informed Israel. But we're moving away from after Samuel and then Kings. We're going to start to move away from some of the more chronological movement that we've been following. So that narrative will get a little bit broken, but this still follows that narrative again, because it goes from where we left off with judges and tribalism to the monarchy. Verse 1, or chapters 1 through 7, as we get into Samuel, it deals with really Samuel as a prophet. And Samuel as a prophet is not a insignificant prophet, and he actually was probably one of the nicer prophets. I mean, you get into some of the major and minor prophets, and you see these strong rebuking or admonitions that they're bringing, and they're sort of bringing clarity. But the interesting thing about it is the birth of Samuel, which you actually get in chapter 1, and then you have Hannah dedicating him to the temple. It is a pretty significant passage and a pretty significant narrative in terms of what ends up happening in Samuel's own call. That sense of, and we all know the story of Samuel sleeping, and he hears God, and he goes to see Eli, and Eli says, "I didn't call you, go back to bed." And then he goes back to bed, and it happens again, and then it happens again, and then the third time, Eli says, "Say, this is your servant is listening. Here I am, your servant is listening." So that sense, that phrase, here am I, or here I am, has permeated Western Christianity. That sense of call, that sense of responding to God's call. A lot of it goes back to this passage. Not only that, and I think this is always interesting, I have a long fascination with monasticism. And monasticism, for those of you who may not be familiar, that has three orders or three levels, or not levels, I don't even want to go, the three orders. And so the first one is the first order, which are monks and brothers. Sort of and it shouldn't surprise you in a patriarchal culture coming up that those were the dominant, that was considered first order. They were the first ones to form. The second group are sisters or nuns. They're considered a second order. Well, there's also a third order that most people don't know about, and they're called secular monastics, or oblates. In the Benedictine tradition, they call them oblates. Sometimes they call them a third order. They call them the Franciscans will call them secular monastics. But what's interesting about that is the idea that you dedicate yourself to a community in service of that community is actually where the idea of Benedictine oblation comes from, or oblation in general. And what that means is, let's say I went to a monastic community, like Benedictine, I don't know if there are any around here, but let's say I went to a Benedictine monastic community, had a really, connected with them and wanted to be a part of them. I could take a vow to a modified version of the Benedictine rule. And then I would be required to live by that rule to some extent in my own life, but then I would go back and I would serve the community that I was a part of. And in many ways, what happened with Hannah and Samuel are considered sort of the first and historically we would call it a confrate, someone who is being offered to the service of the Lord within a community, because Eli was a priest. So, I mean, he was coming into that place where he was being offered to the temple for service of the Lord from his childhood on. He had no other option. His mom dedicated him. It's kind of like boarding school. But this happened all through the Middle Ages, actually, where rich nobility would give monastic communities their children at a very young age, in part because monastic communities were the only ones that actually were literate, and they dealt with literacy, and they wanted their children to be raised with, it's still the Holy Roman Empire, so it wasn't offensive to send everyone's kids to a monastic community. But the idea behind that was there was this continual service in the spirit of Samuel. So that, just sort of an aside for just that understanding of Samuel. It's a pretty significant passage. It's obviously it's that song, "Here Am I, Lord," or "Lord of the Dance." They all sort of take part in that sense of calling. When we see, and then we go on to chapter 2, and you have Hannah's song or prayer. And in that, you have several themes that run through both of these books, or this whole book of Samuel as a whole. One, that God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. That God is faithful despite us, and those are kind of those themes actually have been with us throughout a lot of this. I mean, God is happy with humble and doesn't like the proud. God's faithful despite human disobedience. But the third one is important, that God will raise up a messianic king. And this is a major shift from that tribalism to understand themselves as having one king that almost acts as God's representative, ruling over all of the tribes. And again, that tribalism, through this book sort of is dissipated through just the narrative. But the goal then is to have that one king, or the messianic king. And David is really meant to be that prototype for Israel to introduce the idea of Jesus being the king, not only over Israel, but over everything. King over all the nations, which is actually well timed, since this Sunday is Epiphany Sunday, and we'll be talking about and looking at that idea of the Magi coming and acknowledging Jesus as that Lord and King over all of nations, not just over Israel. Chapter 3, I guess I jumped ahead of it. You get into in the second part of chapter 2, you have Eli's wicked sons, again, hinting towards those parental relationships. I read through a few of those. They're not, they're interesting in noting the frequency of them, but not necessarily in necessarily the content themselves. They don't have anything that you really need to pay attention to. But you have child and Samuel, and 2, you have Samuel being offered, and Samuel's calling comes in chapter 3, and we use that again continually today. And then that kind of is the first break in this book. And then from really 4 to 7, you have this sort of interaction between the Philistines and Israel. And I'm going to give you an overview. But if you're going to read this is a good passage to read. In fact, I found the whole book really kind of interesting. But you have a very interesting sort of movement, and it goes like this. There was a war, and it starts in 5. There's a war with the Philistines, and the Israelites thought, you know what? We're just going to bring out the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to bring it out like a magic token. And because the Ark of the Covenant has served us well, and it's where God's Spirit dwells, and it's powerful, we're just going to bring it out. And when we bring it out, everyone, the battle's going to be won, and we won't have to worry. Well, God didn't like this because they were abusing the use of the Ark, and it wasn't, they weren't honoring the Spirit of God within the Ark. And so the Ark actually is stolen by the Philistines. So they lose the battle. The Philistines take it back to the coast with them. And they landed in a town, and they stick it in a town called Dagon, and they're thinking, hey, we got Israel's prize Ark of the Covenant. But then all of a sudden, God throws some plagues at them. Before that, though, I take that back. Before that, in chapter 5 is a great one. God actually beats the Philistines on his own, without any help, without any army. God's like, you know what? I don't really need the Israelites to do this. I'm just going to, give you a good whooping. And then plagues come, and Dagon, or Daikon, or whatever it is, or however it's pronounced. They start to see tumors, and they're like, hey, this Ark of the Covenant's not doing us well. Let's get rid of it. So then they're like, what do we do with it? Let's send it to Gath, another city in the Philistine area. And then the same thing happened in Gath. Everyone gets tumors. And they're like, well, let's get rid of it. And then they're like, let's send it to Elkron. And then, so they sent it to 3 different cities in the Philistine area. And every single time God smites them with tumors. And they get to the point where they're like, this isn't working. We have this Ark of the Covenant. We thought we had a good, we stole a good thing. It's kind of like stealing a mascot from your rival school and then having it backfire on you. So and so then they eventually send it back to Israel. They just don't want it anymore, and so basically, God kind of on his own actions moves it so that this Ark is passed through the Philistine community, and then eventually makes it back to the Israelites. And that's important because then the Israelites get this through no effort or no initiative of their own. The Ark of the Covenant actually it was returned to them, and then you get into, and that brings us up to chapter 8. And which is where Israel starts to say, hey, we realize that the tribal nature of how we're functioning, our battles with the Philistines aren't going well. We clearly aren't doing well. We need to have something. We want a king. And so they seek out Samuel, who is an adult at this time, and they say, hey, you're a prophet of God. We want a king. And then let me flip over here to chapter 8. So Israel demands a king. And then God grants the request through Samuel. God says, okay, if you want a king, I'll just go with it and see where it happens. And they weren't saying, God, give us a king. They said, oh, we want a king, and this is the type of king we want. And you have Saul, and they chose Saul. And I remember, even as a kid from Sunday school, I remember this picture. I just, for some reason, I have in my mind, it was sort of in that, biblical style drawing, but they showed Saul being this tall man above everyone else. And he was good looking, and he was just impressive as a human being, and and strong in stature, and a good warrior, and everyone thought he was, seemed like a good leader. And so it was a sense of saying, hey, we want this guy as our leader. But the interesting thing is, as we know now, that Saul turns out to not really be that great of a guy. He's dishonest, he's prideful, he lacks integrity, but yet God still anointed him to the position. And that's an interesting sort of relationship that God has with Israel. God is still saying, hey, I'm going to give you a king. You chose him. he's not who I would choose, but, you know, far be it from me to you know, meddle with your choice, but you can have him. And it seems like it goes okay for a little while, but then Saul starts to disobey God. And you see in chapter 13 and 15, there are instances of Saul disobeying. Samuel comes and rebukes Saul in chapter 13. And then Israel, and Samuel says Israel needs a humble king, and he rebukes Saul for being arrogant. And then in 15, God just absolutely rejects Saul, says, I'm done with him. And then God sends Samuel to anoint David in chapter 16, 1 through 13. And so you have this beginning of this idea of David. And this is where we sort of pick up the story where in Sunday school, if you've ever been in Sunday school, I'm sure you have, you remember David was one of the stories you hit every year. You know, one of the major figures, a man after God's own heart. And David is a significant figure because he came from this sort of humble beginnings. And again, just coming out of that Advent season, David was the son of Jesse, who was the son of Obed, who was related to Ruth, and it goes on back to the lineage. So David is this sort of this lineage that comes through. And then you have him in the story of David and Goliath in chapters 16 and 17. And if I'm moving too fast, let me know. I know I'm trying to cover a lot of material, but if you have any questions or anything, or you feel free to interrupt. So David is anointed as king in 16. And then you have the story of David, and David plays the lyre for Saul, and Saul is captivated by him and loves him like his own son. Jonathan is his own son, and Jonathan and David develop this relationship, and it just seems like everything's great. But then David and Goliath happens, and as you know the story, David beats the Philistines with a swinging of a stone in his sling, and it supposedly hits Goliath in the head, and he falls down. He chops off his head. I mean, I just even in the good parts, you have these sort of gory, I just have this vision of like Dave. They didn't have like a nice samurai sword that maybe make a clean cut. They probably had really dull swords, and they had to like saw it off, and he's like holding it up, and I have this sort of vision of this very gross scene. But this was a major turning point for Israel, because up to this point, the battle with the Philistines was up and down. They won some, they lost some, and this was a major shift. And had God not shown up through David and conquered the Philistines in that, the outcome would have been different. I mean, it would have been the Israelites would have been enslaved by the Philistines, and the Philistines would have spread east over to the Dead Sea, or the Dead Sea, no, the Red Sea, and moved over there and taken over the land and occupied the people. So David then through 18 through 20 works for Saul. He plays music. He has a number of roles that he plays. Saul's still liking him, but as David's popularity grows, Saul begins to turn on him, and you see that in 18, really through the whole chapter of 18 into 19. Saul starts to fear that David's growing popularity, and he basically threatens his life, and he's coming after to kill him. So David flees into the hills, and through 19 through 22. And then you have a couple cases where David had a chance to kill Saul, but even though the guy is trying to kill him, he doesn't kill him. He doesn't take advantage of that. And you see the story of David and Jonathan and their friendship, and the importance of that, and we still draw from that sense of friendship today. But what happens is that ultimately leads to, where are we at? 26. David spares Saul's life a second time in 26. The first time was back in, where is it? David eludes Saul into the wilderness in 23. In 24, David spares Saul's life. So there's one instance. And then you have the death of Samuel. So now you don't have a prophet leading, and you still have, evil Saul. But then you have David again in chapter 26 sparing Saul's life. And this is not something to be overlooked. Again, the humility of this servant of God, even in the face of, honestly, if someone's trying to kill me and I got to run for it, and I can't say that I would, actually, I can't say that I would kill him, but I might, take a few punches or something just to get some retribution. But if someone's trying to kill me, I'm not, so there was a sense back then Why wouldn't have David killed him to stop this pursuit of his life? But David, yet still called by God, anointed by Samuel, is in this place where he's saying, no, I'm not going to do that. He honors the king. He ends up fleeing. But then eventually, by the end of the book, David serves with King Achish from Gath in the Philistine area. And then Saul consults a medium, so he's resorting to other things outside of the Israelite God. And ultimately, the Philistines reject David as their king, and David is sent back into the Israelite camps. And then you have in 31 the death of Saul and his sons, which rounds out that first part of the narrative. So you have what you have in that book really is towards the second half of Samuel is that, you have the rise of Saul really quickly, and then you have this sort of decline of who Saul is. But at the same time, while Saul is declining, you have this rise in David's popularity and power. And you see sort of God saying, this is my servant. This is the one I've chosen, not the one you've chosen. So he protects them until Saul's death. And once Saul is dead, there's nothing standing in his way, and David then becomes king. All right, let's pause there for a second before we enter into that second book. And you can, any questions before we jump into 2 Samuel?
Yeah.
That was a great summary.
Yeah, it was.
Thanks.
Was it during this time that David wrote the Psalms, like many of the Psalms that about being pursued by his enemies, things like that?
Yes and no. There is some presumption that some of the things that were written during this period, but the vast majority of the Psalms that we have would have been written probably in the period that took place in 2 Samuel. Again, our 2 Samuel, because you have then David in a role of a king, and he's writing with that perspective of leading into battle, leading through battles, God being with them, God, where you God. And so, and David, funny thing is we often say David was a man after God's own heart. God promised in the everlasting covenant that he would never take his love away from David. I mean, David, among all of the biblical figures, you have Abraham sort of standing out, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then you have these sort of not B characters like Joseph and other, but they're not those dominant characters. But you have that Moses character, then you have Abraham, Moses, and then you have David. And David represents again that, and we'll look at that covenant that comes out in Samuel 2, is significant. God says he'll, no matter what David does, he will never take his love away from him. And that sets the stage. And it also coincides with the Israel's understanding of themselves as a nation. So there's this sense of this unified body of Israelites, and this, and maybe not by chance, that after they form themselves in this sort of body, it takes about 1,000, and I don't remember the datings of all the books, but I know a lot of those books were formulated or compiled from that 1,000-year BC to Christ's birth, or really the 2nd century before Christ's birth. You have the formulation of those books. And again, just like us in the first few centuries after Christ, we're formulating books and compiling books and pulling them together and canonizing them and recognizing them as authority in God's inspired word, because it forms them as a people in the same way it forms us as a people. And really, and in the same way, if I want to draw a parallel, in the first, they say in the first 3 centuries of the early church, there were no unified doctrines. Like people just, baptismal liturgies were different rites, different ways to, just people's understanding of, the Trinity, for example, wasn't even a doctrine that was, again, formulated until Constantine and the Council of Nicaea in 325. So you didn't even have any sort of unified understanding of the Trinity prior to 325. Or, not that you didn't have it, it was there, but it wasn't agreed upon. But once a doctrine or idea is agreed upon, and it's called a plausibility structure. When enough people just get together and say, we all believe this, it establishes a baseline for understanding, and that understanding is what gives rise to human identity.
But
it's like language. What's that?
Didn't that go on even after that for several years? There was still the argument of the Trinity for another 100 years. Oh yeah,
the nature of all the way. All the way to the Great Schism in the 11th century, of the question of the nature of the Holy Spirit. you know, and honestly, even today, people, you know, whether we, when I was, before I was Presbyterian, when I was back in sort of, when I was in my ambiguous stage between the Assemblies of God and the Presbyterian world, I remember those understandings of, you know, of really trying to wrestle, like, what does it actually mean to confess these things, and what do the different denominations believe, and why do they believe this? But those are all identity forming things. And this is, just as an aside, this is, you know, as a Christian educator, at the core of who I am. And I, you know, I've been doing youth ministry most of my life, Christian education most of my life. You know, my PhD is in Christian education, spiritual formation, and discipleship. So I've studied that idea. And the problem we have with this text, like David and Moses, we tend to take these stories of, you know, David and Goliath, or David and Saul, or David and Jonathan, and we try to make moral object lessons out of them. And Israel is not, Jews don't try to make moral objective lessons or character-based lessons out of them. They are telling these stories, and they repeat these stories, and they show the unification of Israel because it's about identity, how you understand yourself. And my argument for Christian education right now within the PCUSA, and really mainline Christianity as a whole, really, is that we shouldn't be educating for character, we should be educating for identity. Because out of identity, character then makes a difference. Otherwise, it's just sort of loosey-goosey. And that's kind of why even some of the stuff we're doing now, it probably seems like, oh, I didn't even, you know, now that I see it all in a narrative-based path, you know, in some sort of chronology, and you see the consistency in the movement, we don't learn that in Sunday school. I mean, you know, we're like, oh, this week we're going to look at David. Next week we're going to look at, you know, this person or this person or this person. And they're all disjointed, and they're often based on, you know, just on character or virtue rather than actually just the experience. Because again, none of these guys are good. I mean, David, I mean, we're about to get into 2 Samuel where it gets ugly. I mean, David, like, what a jerk. But God loved him. So that's an aside.
Just a note.
Yeah.
Speaking of stories, if the Philistines would have seen Indiana Jones, they'd have known better not to mess with that covenant.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a terrifying scene with all those scary faces coming out.
And is the Ark in the museum in California, or where is it from Indiana Jones?
Yeah, it probably is. It's probably in, like, you know, Madame Tussauds made in wax somewhere. No, but I think, you know, but that idea of that but again, that's just to kind of draw that into the whole narrative. Again, don't forget that the Ark of the Covenant is about God's presence. And it went from Adam and Eve being very close, walking in the garden, and then the fall happened and God goes up here. And then for hundreds of years, the only way you see God is through a cloud or through fire or through some sort of, you know, some sort of manifestation in the material world. And then that's what made that dwelling in that Ark of the Covenant during the wilderness time so important, because now it was God dwelling with Israel, was with them. And then God allowed them to build this tabernacle of tent, you know, made of tents, and because God permanently had a space when they were in the promised land. And now, as we see, and although David's not the one that will build the temple, because at the end of 2 Samuel, David says, hey, I want to build a temple for you so you have a permanent place that's established. And God says, you know, you're not going to do that. But that sense of that closeness, now when God has a home or a place in a temple that Solomon built, then God is dwelling permanently with them. And then you have in Jeremiah, as we'll look many, many weeks ahead, that sense of that new covenant, again, that says God will dwell in us. And that closeness from walking in the garden to go up and then sort of making his way back down, finally to that. And then we just had Christmas, that sense of that incarnation, of that God dwelling among us, that sense of, I mean, God loved us so much and wanted to experience so much of where they dwelled with us, walked on the earth that we walked on. So that Ark of the Covenant is very much about, not just about power, but about God's presence. Okay, any other comments? If I'm moving too fast, I'm sorry. There's 2 books to cover is a lot. Anything else?
Can I just I'm going to make something. Now, don't take this wrong, guys. But you, like you said, God expressed himself as fire and brimstone. He expressed himself in all these ways. Did you ever think then, after all of that, he decided to come in the form of a baby on Christmas Eve. And just, you ever think how all those different forms that he approached himself to humans, and then he came as a child.
And that incarnation, and that really is why I like to emphasize the incarnation, and why I love Epiphany, because it's the Gentile acknowledgement that God became human. And then again, you'll hear this for every Christmas. I'm going to be saying the same thing. We trivialize God's incarnation in the manger, unfortunately. Now, that doesn't mean I don't appreciate the manger and the humility of it. I mean, it's the ultimate humility. You're in a trough that was built to feed animals, and then under persecution. I mean, like, there was nothing fancy about it whatsoever. It was not the way anyone imagined the Messiah coming. But I don't want to allow that humble beginning and that cuteness of the baby and the swaddling cloth and the animals all around, that we have this image of what that is, to detract from the fact that this was the ultimate form of transcendence.
Well, that's what I mean. It just, after all those other things, look what happened. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that's a significant part. And actually, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, again, the incarnation is really one of the more significant holy days, and we acknowledge that in Epiphany, not just Christ's birth, but Christ's kingship. Yeah, go ahead, George.
C.S. Lewis said that the greatest miracle is not the atonement or the resurrection, but the incarnation.
It is. I agree. 100%. Because I mean, honestly, Jesus died, they crucified him. The resurrection is pretty impressive too, but it's not the first time we've seen a resurrection. I mean, Lazarus was resurrected, the centurion's daughter was resurrected. Like, there were other resurrections being brought back from the dead. That's not like, it's not like old news or anything, but the idea that the divine would become human in the form of Christ. Now, I will say as well, this is interesting, just in terms of parallels. In Greek mythology, Zeus is sort of compared to that God Yahweh type figure, and Hercules is half God, half human, and dwells among and is the most powerful human on this earth. So you even, as you explore, and maybe after we go through the whole Bible, we'll do that. But as you explore other religions, you see a lot of similarities, and you see that in Greek culture as well, that idea of a half God. But Greeks would say Hercules was half God, half human, whereas Christians will confess that God was 100% God, 100% human. But still, that sense of the divine, or the non-material becoming material and dwelling, is not something to overlook. Okay. 2 Samuel, what time is it? 6:11. Okay. 2 Samuel. Do you want to do this? Do you want to go 2 Samuel, or do you want to chit chat more about 1 Samuel?
Let's go on.
Go for it.
Okay.
All right. You're an ambitious crowd. Okay. You can kind of divide 2 Samuel up into two parts. Really, you have 1 through 20, which describes David and his relations. And it's kind of like he starts off the book really well, or this section of Samuel very well, and he's doing well. But then it's kind of like it takes a nosedive pretty quickly. The first part of it sounds good. Things are going well for David, and then it dive bombs. And that leads up to really chapter 20. And then in 21 through 24, and we'll address that, and it probably won't even make it, I'll sort of show the parallelism. And the reason 21 through 24 is significant to both Samuels, or Samuel as a whole book, because that's where you see a lot of that parallelism from the beginning. And you even see that in 21 to 24, you see a lot of, and that's really throughout all of Hebrew, or all of, Hebrew writing, Hebrew poetry, Hebrew prose has a lot of that sort of, let's put this here and then we'll put this down here and we'll come back to that. But it starts with David's lament in chapter 1 of Saul's death, which I think is fascinating, because again, Saul tries to kill him, and even though he didn't kill him, you may not have liked him, but he still had this sense of Saul as a father figure, or as a maybe even a mentor. So he begins the first chapter of 2 Samuel, and he offers a lament for his death. And then in chapter 2, David is anointed king of Judah. And Judah, again, was one of the kingdoms. You have Judah and you have Israel that kind of developed, and then it eventually became all of Israel. Judah was the southern kingdom. Israel was the northern kingdom. I believe I'm getting those geographically correct. But you have, again, showing that sense of David's humility, the sense of like, he's just, he's not like, hey, he died and I'm king now. It's all for me. It's a sense of, hey, there's a loss there. And so we have in recorded scripture, that's an important part, again, going back to those themes of David's sense of humility. And then in chapter 2 through 6, you have this sort of this exchange between the tribes of Israel and David, where they're asking to be unified under one kingship. And you have a number of battles that David wins, and then David basically takes over Jerusalem and calls it Zion. And this is the first time now that Israel is in the promised land, is as a monarchy or a kingship established. And you sort of feel like this is a major turning point in the whole story of Israel's development. And it connects back to that understanding, again, of the promises that God gave to Abraham. Not only, this is Abrahamic religion of those descendants, and that was taken care of. The name, Abraham's name, still was there. David would still look to Abraham as the patriarch, and the land. And that land is now firmly occupied. They've established themselves in a kingdom. They have, they're winning battles. God's with them. David now moves the Ark of the Covenant out of the wilderness of Canaan into Jerusalem. And this is where you see David asking God if he can build him a temple. And then in 5, you have David anointed over a king over all Israel, and Jerusalem is made the capital of Israel. Philistines are beat. Chapter 6, David brings the Ark of the Covenant to there. And then in 7 is probably one of the more significant passages in 2 Samuel. And I just want to read you a passage. If you want to look at, if you have your scriptures with you, and in the beginning of 7, David's saying, hey, let me do this, let me move. And God's saying no. And then it'll say, where is it? God's telling him, I'll appoint you as judge over my people. He says, in verse 12, when your days are fulfilled, you lie down with your ancestors. I will raise up for you an offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, meaning his lineage, and I will establish his kingdom. And again, this is a foreshadowing of what's to come. He should build a house for my name, meaning Solomon, but there's also overtones to just what that means in a broader sense. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So it wasn't David's throne that was established forever, because it was established after David. So the question becomes, was he talking about Solomon, or was he talking about Jesus? I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. Again, that familiar parental type language. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with the rod. And this is where it sort of tips back towards Solomon. Mortals will use and blows inflicted by human beings. In other words, he's not going to take away the things that thwart him or the natural consequences. But verse 15, and this is an important one, but I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. Verse 16, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever in accordance with all of the words and with this vision. And Nathan spoke that to David. And so Nathan was the prophet at the time of when David took over his kingship. And then David offers a prayer. And you have that sense of this new covenant, that God will never take God's love away from David. And that connects that back to that Abrahamic sense of through him all nations. And if you go on, it says, therefore, in 29, now therefore it may please you to bless the house of your servants, so that it may be continued forever for you. O Lord, have spoken, with your blessing shall be for the house of your servant, and a blessing, and will be blessed forever. And that sense of that blessing would continue on. And here's the interesting thing is, Jews have been blessed, although they've gone through quite a journey. It's not a, you know, I don't feel like I'm saying something ethnically insensitive, but Jews are a blessed people in many ways, and we see that in our nation in particular. But that sense of that blessing that God told Abraham would extend to the nations is there in this passage and in this covenant, and that sense of that promised Messiah. And you see that that same promise and that same reiteration of this covenant filter into the Psalms. You know, and these are just tossing them out: 272, 132, 145. You see it in Isaiah, you see it in Ezekiel, you see it in Zechariah. So you keep going back to this Davidic covenant of the fact that God will never take God's love away from David, and that there will be a blessing that extends beyond David's kingdom and to Solomon, and then all the way to Christ. And then obviously when Christ came on the scene, it extends it to all nations, not just Israel. I'll take a breath there, because now we're going to dive into Bathsheba. No, so the next 10 chapters, now we see what kind of a jerk David was. And this is the part where I'm like, you know, we often like, oh, you want to be like David. David, you know, David came from humble beginnings. God gave him victories. God anointed him. God orchestrated all of this because David was God's chosen one. And I will say this, one thing that I have a pet peeve about, you know, it says that God knew David when he was within his mother's womb. And there's this sense of the uniqueness of David. I always find it irritating when we use in the church that idea. And yes, God does know each of us when we're in our mother's womb. But when that verse is being referenced, it's talking about David, and it's specific to David and the unique role that David played within the story in Israel. And so that you have this character developing up through 1 Samuel, being sort of established, and all of a sudden is king over all of Israel, and all of this good stuff is happening. And you think that David would be like, hey, this is perfect. Now everything's going great. Like, I'm loving it. Like, life's good. God's blessing us. We're growing as a nation. And then what happens? In chapter 11, a passage that I've preached on too many times in my life as an Assemblies of God young man, but it says in chapter 11, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle. And this is an important part. That first phrase, I see Donna shaking her head. You know this. He should have been out there in battle. He was a military king. He was a leader, and kings went out to battle. But David got lazy, and he stayed back at the palace, and all the troops went out. And what does David do? He's peering at his cow, you know, and it wouldn't have been uncommon, you know, sometimes in our puritanical mindset, we're like, oh, he was spying on someone taking a bath. Well, nudity was far more prominent back then. And, you know, all you're wearing is a gown, and you got to bathe together and all those sort of things. It wasn't even that he was looking at her naked body. It was that he saw her from a distance, and then he summoned her to him, and then he wooed her. And obviously he's the king of Israel. She's not going to fight him. But now Bathsheba is brought into his courts, and he has sex with her. And now all of a sudden Nathan comes and he confronts him, and he says, you know, how can you do this? How can you, you know, and the interesting thing, actually, I take that back. David sleeps with her, and then David realizes what he did. And then he plans to take Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, and he sends him to the front line to say, you know what, I can just cover up this little mishap here. I'll just get rid of Uriah, and then I can properly marry Bathsheba. She can become part of my, you know, this was back in the day of polygamy, mind you. And again, you know, when people like to say, you know, our understanding of marriage is biblically based. Well, it is to some extent, but that's loosely based, because David had lots of wives, and his son Solomon had thousands of wives, and they were all having sex on the top of a roof. So there was nothing modest about any of this. So, you know, you got to sort of picture it in the time. So David's sin ultimately almost wasn't even the adultery, although that was a problem. Because still at that time, adultery was defined not by a woman having sex outside of marital relations, but by a man having sex with another man's property, which would have been the woman. Adultery in the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments, is not just about general adultery. It's about violating the property of someone else. And again, patriarchal society, and that factored into it. But Nathan ultimately is rebuking David, not for having sex, or the adultery part of it. I mean, that's part of it. But ultimately, he's rebuking him for trying to cover it up. And that was the sinister nature of it. even in the midst of having all these wives, he still had wanted something that belonged to someone else and then tried to cover it up. But God had already made this promise. I'm not taking my love away from you, so I'm going to stick with you. So God doesn't destroy David. God, David still remains in power. But then God says, you know what, some consequences are going to follow. And this is where it gets a little judgy. I mean, not judgy in the sense of being judged, but in the sense of the book of Judges. Then you have this horrible sort of narrative of David's sons. Again, that parental relationship, parent-child that I talked about at the beginning. David had some children, naturally. And David's son Amnon rapes his sister Tamar. And then Absalom, his other son, has Amnon assassinated. And then Absalom tries to rebel against David, and David has to flee into the wilderness again because he learns about the secret plan. And then Absalom eventually dies. And then even then, after all of this, after all the betrayal, after all the rebukes, after all of the deaths and rapes and everything that are going on, David laments because he's so broken by Absalom's death. And at this point, we sort of see the fullness of David's humanity. So from really, again, 2 Samuel, from that first chapter to 10, you have the rise of David. And from 11 to 20, you just have this sort of like, that was a bad couple of years for David. They probably would like to put past, it's like that was his 2020. Without viruses. I mean, maybe there were some there too. Okay. And then you get to this last chapter, or the last 4 chapters. And this is where, I mean, how am I going to explain it? You have, if you turn to chapter, if you have your Bibles with you, turn to chapter 21. It'll make more sense if I sort of walk you through it. And this is a very poetic thing, and this is meant again to connect the first part of Samuel to the second part of Samuel for us. But you have David. David avenges the Gibeonites. And you have the failure of Saul to beat the Gibeonites, but David does it in 21a and on. And then so the failures of Saul in 21 parallels in 24. I'm going to do them like this: the failures of David. So you have this sort of line drawn between Saul failed. They recollect Saul's failures, and they recollect David's failures. And then the next thing after that one is David. It mentions in 21b, David and his mighty men, which again, in my Assemblies of God background, we're always talking about David and his mighty men, and you want to be one of David's mighty men. I mean, and again, in retrospect, I think that's kind of, well, I won't say what I think about it. But, and then in 23b, you have David and his mighty men again, and they're both in battle with the Philistines. So you have failure, and then you have David, mentions of David and his mighty men. And then you have this section of 22 through 23a, of David's poetic memoirs, where he remembers God's grace, he remembers the covenant promises, and he actually, in that central, those 2 chapters there in the center, not even fully 2 chapters, right there in the center of 22 to 23a, you have this sort of connection back to this the song that Hannah offered at the very beginning. And if you go back to then 1 Samuel. Here it is, 1 Samuel, in that first chapter, or the second chapter, where you have the beginning, where you have Hannah's prayer, you have that sense, those same themes of remembering God's grace, remembering God's covenant promises, and it brings that whole sort of thing to fruition. If you compare David's laments in those 2 chapters there with Hannah's, you'll see those parallels a little bit more clearly. But all in all, you have these 2 books which are really function as one, and the goal of Samuel is for us, for particularly us as Gentiles, for us reading this, it not only tells a story, the full character nature of it that they talk about, but really what it is it's really for us an understanding of movement from that narrative of tribalism to monarchy, and the reestablishment not only of obedience of the covenant that God made with Moses and the 10 Commandments, but now, regardless of whether or not they're obedient, God will not remove his love. And so it's again that furthering of that covenantal promise, or that covenantal movement that comes from do this, be fruitful and multiply. Again, do be fruitful and multiply. I'll give you some stuff to Abraham. Here's some more rules to Moses. And now with David, God's saying, you know what? You're established as a nation. I'm never taking my love away from you. The Messiah is going to come from your line. your son's going to build the temple in which I'll dwell, and you have this movement that carries on from there. And I'm done.
Okay.
All right.
You did it.
Any thought? All right. So any thoughts or does that, did you see how it all sort of connects together? Does that make
Yeah.
sense? You follow the narrative?
Thank you.
And again, for us, for the question then would be, what is the value for us?
Can I ask one question?
Of course.
The main covenant he made with David was that he was going to have the Messiah come through him, or
And the establishment of the kingdom, that the establishment of the kingdom that would follow, the building of the temple, the Messiah that would come, and his everlasting love.
and the
That
kingdom.
everlasting love is really the sort of the important part of that. The establishment of the kingdom too, but I think the nature of God's relationship with David and Israel, and by extension humanity, was that God's love would never be removed. And when you think about, Adam and Eve get booted out of the garden, Noah, and the promise, I'm not going to kill everyone again, to the refinement of a people, to the promise of a people, to the giving of the commandments. Those are all about, again, sort of curtailing and shaping these people. And in the end, it's almost as if God just says, okay, you're established on the earth, and I'm not going to leave you now. I'll always be with you. There was no fear of Israel of ever losing God's love.
And
now,
God picks,
Was that?
I was going to say, and God picks imperfect people to do his thing.
Yeah.
Which is, again, goes back to, like, why do we teach Sunday school around the character of these biblical figures when,
no. Now Jesse was David's father now?
Jesse was David's father, the whole Jesse tree that you did.
Yeah. And what was the significance of Jesse being Jesse?
What do you mean? There really wasn't.
Well, I mean, he was his father, but how did that all pull? I mean, why did he pick him? Why did God pick him?
Why did God pick David?
Yeah, Jesse and all that.
Oh. If I had to guess, because Jesse's line traces back. You go back to Obed, you go back to Ruth, you go back to, beyond Ruth, before they went over and fooled around with the Moabites, going back to, going back to the Israelites' occupation of Canaan. And I mean, why did God include Rahab, a prostitute who just helped 2 spies escape, in that lineage as well?
Well, it's kind of like what was just said, that he picks imperfect people for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but there's no perfect humans in general. But again, that's the challenge that I think that Israel had when Christ came on the scene, because this talk of a Messiah that come establish a throne, they were expecting some governmental sort of overthrow power, like establishing themselves as this nation to rule over all. And then Jesus comes in a manger, the birth of humble birth. So God's constantly, and we've seen that through the last however many books, God's constantly using the humble, the marginalized, God's always trying to mix it up.
The characters in this story, you said that this was a book with pretty well-defined characters. And I get your point that it isn't, like moral role models for us or anything like that, but that we're supposed to look at these. But I find the character of Saul really interesting, because he's kind of a Jekyll and Hyde character, because he seems to very sincerely repent at times. And he tells David how sorry he is for trying to kill him. And then he goes and turns around and tries again to kill him. He flips back and forth. But then in 2 Samuel, you kind of see David the same way. That he starts out being this admirable character, and then, becomes weak and disobedient. And then at the end of you didn't talk about the end of 2 Samuel, but there's kind of a disturbing part in that very last chapter where the Lord punishes David. And he gives him, who is it? Some prophet comes to him, David's prophet Gad, takes a message to him, gives him a choice of 3 punishments. You choose which of these 3 you want.
Choose your own adventure.
And David doesn't, he says he won't make the choice. So then God sends disease and he killed 70,000 people. And so it kind of, it doesn't end on a very high note in terms
No,
of
it doesn't.
covenant that he made with David.
No. And honestly, Solomon's not much better. I mean, Solomon's considered wise, but as the story will carry on as we continue, you'll see. I mean, Solomon is although Solomon's considered wise, you have this continuation where, I mean, again, even the prophets that follow in that will come after in Israel's history, none of them were perfect either. They're often angry. They're often, and again, that's probably the overall. If there's one thing that really seminary left me with was the impression that everyone in the scriptures is pretty screwed up and that God is pretty faithful to all of them.
No. But that doesn't mean that he won't take some pretty harsh punishments against them.
No, I mean, all the way from Samson on, or really all the way through, you see, you going back to Abraham's unfaithfulness, passing off Sarah as his sister and almost getting her, giving her to Pharaoh, to Joseph's brothers trying to kill him, to, the deception with Isaac, it's just one human failure after the next. And again, that's the problem with an understanding of scripture that says that these figures are important to us because they're role models for us, or they show something good. If anything, they're horrible, and God just continues to redeem. God, this is a story about God's relationship with humanity through Israel, not about the righteousness of any human being.
Okay, that's
What's that?
if we were to summarize all of this, what are we supposed to get out of all this, or what all these people are doing? I mean, if you just summarize it very briefly, just like.
I would look at it as God will never let us go. God will always be faithful to us. Even though we're flawed, terribly flawed, God will never leave us. He will always be there for us.
Yeah. Well, I would say, Denny, that sometimes we always want to, and I think that's a product of, well, there's a number of things that feed into that. I don't have time to go into it, but we as a culture right now in American Christianity are always wanting to jump to application. Jews don't do this. It's a problem with the way Western Christians try to use scripture. If you haven't figured out by now, I don't often have an application section in my sermons. Because it's not, I mean, if there is one, I will talk about it, but I'm not going to force an application to a text to tell you how to live your life differently because somehow I think that it's going to shape you. For me, an understanding of scripture as a whole, and that we've been engrafted into this story. I mean, this is the capital S story of redemption. And we all have our own, lowercase s stories that draw us into this narrative that says all of a sudden we were adopted, we were engrafted, we're a part of this story, we're the extension of this covenant. And so if nothing else, we ought to know the history of who we are and God's redemptive of actions throughout the history of the world to redeem the world to himself. Yeah, Donna.
Can't get his attention.
Yeah, he said, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I think one reason he chose David And David was not a perfect man by any means. He did all things that were bad. He showed the sinfulness of man. And if he had chosen a perfect king, one who did all the right things, then there was no reason for Jesus to come and die.
Very good.
I think he's showing us with all how everyone is flawed, that we need a savior. And everyone is sinful, and even David was very sinful, and we need a savior.
The Bible is a book or a compilation of books about God's love, about God's redemption, and about God's faithfulness.
But is it also, I'm just struck by how the book ends with a huge punishment. And is it also God saying that, justice is required? He can't just ignore human sin. A price needs to be paid, and that's why Christ had to come. And
Yeah.
Meanwhile, there were, punishments along the way, but that was just that God said sin has a consequence. And he won't just ignore it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to the idea that, again, that we've seen a little bit more in the New Testament in places, but that all sin is the same, other than blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. So that means that everything Hitler did, as long as he didn't blaspheme the Holy Spirit, is the same as, and it's because it's not about the individual sin. It's about the condition of us as humanity and about our unfaithfulness to God. And it doesn't really make a difference of what unfaithfulness it is. This is the challenge we have in a lot of conversations, whether it be, the church's understanding or view of homosexuals. And we value the sin of homosexuality over the value, we're like, it's okay if you're prideful, but if you're gay, all of a sudden those don't equal. But in God's eyes, it's all sin. You've all been unfaithful to me. And when we understand that sense of unfaithfulness across the board, and that sin in God's eyes is just an estrangement from God and a disobedience, and not to say that those particular sins don't have consequences. And you see that in the end of this, you're pointing out, Glenda, that there were consequences. Now, these were imposed consequences. And there are consequences. If you murder someone, there are going to be some consequences. If you steal a lollipop from the store and no one sees, there probably aren't any consequences. But both are an act of evil against God. Because God is calling us to something greater. God is calling us to be holy, not in the sense of perfection, but again, in the sense of being set apart. So my last question to close us on during this holy season is, what does it mean for us to be set apart in Lake City? You don't have to answer, it's rhetorical. But that's a question that, some of us, the pastors group, is dealing with. What does it mean for us to be a community of faith that is set apart in Lake City? All right.
Let me just say one thing.
Okay,
What would it be like?
Last comment.
What would it be like in Lake City without the community of faith?
Yeah, that's another way of putting it. All right. Well, this was fun. Hopefully it wasn't too much. We are not meeting next week because we will have Epiphany Sunday on Sunday, and I'll be giving and I'll give you some stuff on Sunday to do at home for the congregation that'll help you celebrate Epiphany in your own way at home. But next Wednesday is what my sermon is called. I think I titled it the most forgotten, or the most, I don't remember what I called it, something about the most forgotten holy day. I think we often overlook Epiphany. So next week, as we're not meeting, it's Epiphany. You'll have some stuff to do at home. I'll give you some scriptures to read and some things like that. And then we'll meet again. I don't even know what the date is, the Wednesday following.
Okay.
And I'll put that in the announcements. So let's close in prayer. All right. God of grace and love and redemption and faithfulness, as we have journeyed through the book of Samuel, books of Samuel that you've given us, we see your faithfulness, and we see the establishment of your redemptive plan through Israel and through King David, and we are thankful for that. Today, as we depart, we ask that your Spirit might dwell in us, that we might be prompted by your Spirit to explore these two books. And as we look towards Sunday as a celebration of the Gentile acknowledgement of who you are in Epiphany, and next week in Epiphany, that you just might fill our homes and our own minds with a greater acknowledgement of you as our Lord and King. Be with us as we continue to journey, that you might be our God and our King, and that others might know that we are your children in all that we do and say. In the name of your Son we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Yeah, thank you.